Personally, I don't like to think about death at all. I don't want to think about it, and I would not let myself think too much about it. I guess it is a fear to me, as it brings me to think about the ifs. I fear most the death of my loved ones, and saying this is as far as I would even go for now. When I knew I was going to visit the hospice, I thought that it should be okay for me. I'm safe because I'm only going to see that dying person alive, and I need not to see them again when they are out of breath. It's like the before and the after. I'm going to see only the before and not the after, so I don't need to connect both things to the same person. That was how I felt before visiting the hospice. After the visit, however, I don't think I changed very much concerning my own fears, but I certainly learned the indispensable value of one thing that cannot be overemphasized in medicine, that is listening to the patients.
Apprehension was the main feeling I felt as my partner and I walked the short distance from the hospital to the hospice. There is something very unknown about talking to someone who is dying. They cease to just be another regular patient to me, but instead become special for a number of reasons. Firstly, as someone training to be a doctor, a patient who is dying makes me feel a bit useless. Suddenly, someone's physical symptoms take a back seat to all other aspects in their life, such as spirituality. This can make a doctor's role much more redundant. Secondly, palliative care in dying is a very emotion-filled area. Everyone comes into the situation where they face death, bringing their own experiences and preconceived ideas. This can make dealing with death hard for everyone involved. I was worried about my reactions and emotions as I had not been around many people with a terminal illness, but I had experienced death firsthand when my father died when I was 13.
I was nervous before the visit. My main worry was for my patient's well-being. I did not want to raise any negative feelings or provoke any thoughts which would upset them. It is always hard to know what someone's level of acceptance of their illness is.
Preceding my patient interview, I was fraught with uncertainty about how I should approach the interview with someone so close to death. Not wanting to offend or cause undue discomfort, I wrote down a list of questions thinking that I could always fall back on these, but this was unnecessary. I think having a supposed expiry date made me realise how important each moment is to that person, and I felt that our interview might not be the best way to spend the time that is left to the patient and their family.
Death. The word brings about a myriad of emotions and mental pictures. Rainy day, cold breeze, black clouds, leafless trees, and grey headstones. Tears rolling off cheeks and touching the ground, almost like a tribute to the dead, who will be laid to rest there forever. Death. It's a hard concept to understand because unlike the journeys that we have undertaken in our lives, this has no known destination, no tour guides or information counters. There's no turning back if we have missed an exit. And there's certainly no co-drivers who could read the map for us while we are driving. Death. It scares me a little. I didn't expect much out of the Mary Potter hospice visit. Visiting a cachectic dying patient in a worn-down, dingy building is not a picnic. My aim was to collect as much information as I could and leave before tiring the patient down. I was mentally prepared to face a crying patient. Somehow in my mind, crying goes along with dying.
I have had previous experiences with loved ones who have died before this visit. My piano teacher died when I was 14 years old. He was one of my dearest friends and a whole world to me. He was sick for a long time before he died, and before the end I had to help him to walk the few feet from his seat to the piano to play for me. But despite this, I never thought of him as dying or old. He was too full of life. His death was very unexpected for me. I learned that grief is a process by which you learn to put your pain into a box and get on with your life, because you will always miss them and love them, but you need to keep living. It takes time to even want to do this, to redefine yourself without them. At first you want to hold them so close that you forget nothing. I think I'm still going through the process of grieving, and that this affects the way I talk to people who are dying. They bring up my own grief, and as I'm shoving it back into the corner, I'm worried that I might miss some important issues for them.
Most people would not be able to recall what they were doing on the day of February the 2nd, 2002. Parents were taking children to school, lunch and sandwiches were being shelved in bakeries, and old ladies were complaining about the weather. However, for a father that has suffered of pancreatic cancer, that day was the last. His shriveled body was lying still over the sterile-looking sheet, covered by the blue jumper that hugged his child good night numerous times. The images passes in front of my eyes. I'm 15, and I'm standing in the middle of a hospital corridor in Eastern Europe. The walls are green, the nurses are flustered, and the air smells of food. There's a young, tall doctor talking to me. Words are coming out of his mouth like typing on the computer screen. I hear them, one by one, but I do not know what he's saying. My biological father has passed away. I don't understand, and I run away. I go home to a loving stepfather. I started grieving by denying any loss. Now, I'm 23. The walls are green, the nurses are flustered, and the air unfortunately smells of feces. There's a 65-year-old man, Takamori. He's talking to me. He's trying to contribute to my medical education through sharing his personal experience of terminal illness. In the next 30 minutes, he will recall about the time of his diagnosis, the experience of living in the hospice, the feeling of depression, the impact of his family, and the experience with the medical team. Furthermore, he will kindly share his personal opinion on what makes a good doctor. A feeling of anxiety mixed with curiosity has been swathing my body since the night before this visit. I could feel the heaviness lying on my chest as soon as I began my preparation for the interview. My anxiousness was directly linked to the topic of death. The brain has an extraordinary power of storing negative experiences and retrieving them at the slightest triggers. I was anxious that this visit would be just another trigger. However, I was driven by the opportunity to improve on my skills as a future doctor. Furthermore, my curiosity was raised by the possibility of gaining new insights into the coping mechanisms used by patients faced with a death sentence. However, I have long been aware that my career choice is moderately based on a subconscious solution to avoid the pain of losing another loved one.
I was greeted by Dr. Brian Enser, who was holding a light bulb. He was about to change the fused-out bulb of a patient's bedside lamp. I could not help but wonder, where else can we find a bulb-changing doctor who goes the extra mile to ensure patient comfort, except for in palliative care? I have met doctors who would rather wait for hours for a technician or orderly to arrive, to do something trivial because it does not fit their job description. Dr. Enser has succeeded in inspiring me just by holding a light bulb.
My partner and I sat down next to her bed and in our nervousness launched straight into the kaupapa of the interview without bothering to do any whakawhanaungatanga. I told Mrs. P that we had come to discuss her experiences of being ill and support networks around her. She interrupted me and scolded us to introduce ourselves personally to her and be clearer about what we wanted from her. It is important to Mrs. P that health professionals personally introduce themselves to her and clearly state their purpose. She found it much easier to trust people when they did these simple things.
Miss Armstrong, a younger, relatively lively-looking woman, was sitting up and alert and reading a book, A Girl with a Dragon Tattoo, and while struggling to breathe, she still managed a vibrant smile as we approached her bed. "Great book, isn't it?" was the opening line of our conversation. This would have never entered my mind before the interview, but it functioned well in relaxing the patient and building rapport before we had even introduced ourselves. I did not expect a woman as young as Miss Armstrong to be so accepting of her situation, so I asked her how she remained so calm through this experience. She reflected that initially it was very hard to let go of those things I couldn't do any longer, but if you try to focus on the positives and realise there's no point in crying over spilt milk, it all makes sense. She also mentioned that you can still have goals, and although these might change from climbing mountains to learning languages, it is still achievement at the end of the day. I have no doubt that her positive attitudes have made her experience of terminal illness much easier for both her and her loved ones.
After a gentle inquiry, Takamori recalls his first night in the hospice. There were people dying all around me. I got up and went to the receptionist to ring my wife to take me home. I was depressed. I asked what changed his mind, and I get a vague answer. In my attempt to find out more, I use long silences and probing questions. I'm interested in knowing if he's scared of dying, and if so, how does he handle the feeling, what is important for him, and what would help. However, I'm aware of the other 3 patients in the room and the numerous numbers of carers around us. I feel that we lack privacy. Also, I'm slightly distracted by the pain expressed by the patient behind me. As a consequence, several minutes later, the conversation is trivial, and I still find myself standing behind Takamori's wall of braveness. I accept my position, and I just ask what helped with overcoming his depression. Takamori tells me about a cruise around the islands. We chat about his experience for a while. I make a mental note to medicate myself with a cruise one day.
Our patient was a slight old woman. She was immaculately dressed and had been made up to look her Sunday best. She was in a large room with 4 beds. There were flowers on the bedside cabinet, and the place shone with light. It was warm and welcoming. Even the smell of the place was pleasant. I noticed a wine glass on her lunch table. She saw me looking at it and smiled as she told us of the lovely glass of wine she'd received with her lunch. I was taken aback by the ambience of the place. I had spent a lot of time in many rest homes, and I expected the hospice to be very similar, but I was pleasantly surprised. We asked her about how she found the hospice, and I was pleasantly surprised by her comments. She talked of how wonderful the hospice was, exclaiming it was better than any flash hotel. We asked what it was that made it so special. She was clear in the fact that the staff were like angels, and they were all such lovely, friendly people. They would always go out of their way to help, and were like no other medical staff she had encountered in the public hospital system. She finished by exclaiming, "I don't know how they get people to leave here."
The day came for my visit to the hospice, and I noticed more details around me than I normally would from day to day. It was raining hard, but I did not hasten my pace to get out of the rain.